We are live. And we are live. This is Dark Journalist, and it's great to have everyone back here for part 13 of our X series. And of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everyone.
And tonight's going to be an extra special show because we're going to really go deep into something that I touched upon in a previous episode, which would be episode 10, part 1. And part 2, which was all about this Theosophical Anthroposophical Mystery School foundation for all of these different spiritual movements that we saw in the general trend of conversation, the general trend of things in culture, the general trends that we're witnessing in the political shakeups over the following century, from the 19th century into the 20th century, and what we're looking at now. And I touched on this figure, Ahriman, and I touched on this figure, the Eighth Sphere, which both come directly out of the anthroposophical literature. And it's kind of amazing when we look at Rudolf Steiner's work in terms of the things that it encompassed. He certainly was prolific, but he got into so many different areas with such skill, and that really makes him stand out in history, I believe. And he wasn't afraid to tackle the truly controversial issues. Certainly, spiritualism had been very widespread in the period that he was in. It was just coming out of that sort of late 19th century buzz on all that, and it was starting to get into one of those periods, you know, like we're in with UFOs now, where it's silly hour and everyone pops up with a different crazy story. So they were deep into that here, and you might see a repeat of that pattern of the whole UFO file craze mixed with this kind of spiritualist craze. If we can look at them both, we get a better picture of each. But one of the things that I really want to zero in on tonight is the fact that the X steganography idea inhabits the deep, deep realms of thought when going into things like the Eighth Sphere, when going into Ahriman. We're dealing with exactly the same thing that we're looking at when you and I are looking for the kind of messaging that's going on, that steganography, that hidden mode of communication that's happening. So it's great to have such a big crowd with us tonight. It's going to be a great night. And I already see we have a lot of our super regulars out there. And it's great to see that. What I want to do for the next couple of minutes is just kind of recap what the X steganography is. And if those of you who are very familiar with it will allow, so that for the new people who are coming in to get a handle on what it is that we're talking about, it's good to kind of reiterate it and give us the base from which we're drawing our conversation. So the X steganography is something I discovered, and it was going really into black projects. And when I started doing research on black projects, I started to go to places like MIT and started to look at archives at universities where these people worked in order to find out, you know, where exactly was this X steganography coming from. So like a program would go black, like Blue Gemini, for example, and would be reborn as like X20. And so every time a project went black, this other thing would come up and it would have this X as general messaging. Now, of course, we encounter X in so many normal ways. In our regular lives, we'd get into a situation where we'd say, well, you know, you're going to find the X series car or the X series plane, but they were using these very deliberately. And so I traced it back to the work of Walter Dornberger, who was one of the paperclip scientists that we brought over. And anytime we would get around things like the UFO file and that whole Majestic 12 idea, and people like Vannevar Bush, who were at MIT, we find all these connections again into this X messaging. So the X was something that was coming up over and over again in my research. Then when I started to encounter situations like looking into the Nixon years, I found out that he was keeping a time capsule. And, you know, I had these incredible people come forward and tell me about this. And Robert Merritt was one of them, and he had worked for the Houston plan. And so he tied in this idea of the X to the time capsule. And then I went into Eisenhower's history, and Eisenhower had a Project X. And that's to be opened in 2053. Well, that was a Project X time capsule that Eisenhower had. So these presidents had it. And then we go into LBJ. Well, what did you know? LBJ had an X letter at his library not to be opened until 50 years after his death. Well, guess what? That's coming up in 2023. So the succession of X's kept coming up. And then when I explored John Trump's connections, who was President Trump's uncle, when I explored his connections to all this and his connection to Tesla and how the FBI had called him in to look at Tesla's papers and how Tesla's papers were about shooting down flying objects, but they didn't call them planes, it got very interesting. And I said, well, Olivia, let's go over there and let's check it out. One of the interesting things that I found out was that the box that John G. Trump's papers were in at MIT were in box X. I mean, this thing, you couldn't make it up. The sequence of events and the steganography of using the X by these groups deep inside the government, moving these programs around, was phenomenal. And so what happened is during this process, I opened up the idea of the X steganography and where they started using it. And that's where we got into the territory of understanding that the Theosophical Society had used it extensively and that it had come up around John Keely's research. And Keely was an inventor like Tesla. So I'm going to show a lot of pictures tonight because we're going to get used to these characters and get the idea of who they were and the periods they were in. But we have some pretty heavy blockbusters around the Eighth Sphere and around Steiner's work and around Ahriman. And what this does, it takes us into a different level of research. That is, I can look at things as a journalist and understand them a particular way. But the Eighth Sphere requires a kind of mystical interest because it goes beyond what somebody would just merely describe journalistically. However, if you're just looking at it from a journalistic point of view, you can still get a lot out of how this all came about and how this all works. But I would say with this episode in particular, and why this might be a template for how we close the second part of the X series when we get to the 20th episode, we're really getting deep into the idea of the mystery schools having a war, and that a lot of information came out. And it was like nobody knew what was going to happen once that information got out. It was, in government terms, you call it above top secret. In mystery school terms, it is not to be entered into. It's not to be named. So you really had something happen there in the 19th century, and that sets us up for the massive secrecy that takes over the 20th century. And those forces that forced open a lot of those secrets from the mystery schools were incredibly brave. And as we're going to find out, those forces that opened up the mystery schools boiled down to 14 different individuals, no more than that, which is remarkable when you think about the scale of mystery schools and the geography of mystery schools. Well, we're going to learn that 14 individuals came forward inside of those mystery schools and let these things out. And the reason there was this war of the mystery schools is because the great majority of those schools, and there are many different types, some of the schools really are not the kinds of schools we'd even want to know about because they don't engage in things, they're the kind of secret societies that wouldn't be kind of, on an ethical level. They may know a lot, but, they belong to a certain type of group. But the great majority of these secret societies were societies that had carried information down from a period over thousands of years. And some of them had grown with the information. Some of them had done quite well with it. And others really had degenerated so that they were just keeping the information and not really knowing even why at a certain point. So you had all different variations there, and you had these incredible groups who were very much on top of what needed to be done. But all the groups were united in one thing, that in 1840, there was such a heavy emphasis that came in around scientific materialism. And this rose all those groups up and made them all pay attention, because the really hardcore mystery school groups who were looking at the society of humanity and thinking to themselves, how is this thing going to grow? How are we going to kind of achieve the next step in our spiritual understanding and integrate these things into culture? Remember, they had just gotten out of things like slavery and all the rest. And you wouldn't even get to the Emancipation Proclamation until 1865. So we're in 1840. We're seeing, we're just coming out of some of these things. And they're looking around, and when the scientific materialism comes in, a number of these groups recognize the impulse that is going to trap mankind, and that there's not going to be any way for mankind to get out of that trap, which is boiling everything down to a scientific formula. And that eventually even the churches, which resented a lot of the mystery schools and didn't want this kind of information going out, eventually even they joined with them and said, you got to get this out, because they're going to run us out of town with this scientific stuff, and mankind is going to be in this kind of complete denial of its spiritual life. This is the nature of the situation when we get to 1840. This is what sparks the mystery school war. And I think it's legitimate to call it a war. You could call it a large, heavy-duty disagreement, but I call it a mystery school civil war. So we're going to get into that and how that figures into people like Blavatsky and Steiner and Annie Besant coming on the scene there at the end of the 19th century to kind of save the day. And but it also explains a lot of the incredible waves of spiritualism that we saw rolling out there around this period. And we had this incredible spiritualist craze in America. We had seances in London, in Paris, all around the world. And these things were becoming commonplace. People were starting to realize, hey, I can communicate with my dead relative, psychic experience. It was an incredible renaissance of these ideas. There was only one problem. The mystery schools that had stepped forward to bring this information out to the public and realized that, we can't wait 100 years for this thing to progress, but within 100 years, we won't recognize humanity. And this was the position that they were coming from. So they worked with individuals, people like the Poughkeepsie Seer, people like Emma Britton, and people who would eventually form the foundations of a lot of groups around theosophy. And what happens is these people come forward and they are incredibly talented mediums and somnambulists, and they have the ability to enter into these realms. And so they're basically profiled by these mystery schools, and they say, this person can help us do it. They have the right kind of psychic ability. They have the right kind of ethical intention. Let's use them. Let's work with them. And the Fox sisters, who are these group of sisters who come forward and do this massive kind of seance movement and the massive mediumship movement that kicks in, they're really at the heart of it, the center of it. And they're excellent, but it just so happens that they're getting help from these mystery schools who really want to bring this information out. And the idea is to recreate and spotlight and focus on this spiritual impulse in mankind so that it can run side by side against the scientific materialism that has crept in. Now, the scientific materialism that has crept in is being ordered up by a force that Steiner calls Ahriman. And we're going to get into what Ahriman is all about, but the bottom line with what the fear that they had in these groups, in the mystery schools, was that this force was going to come in that was Ahrimanic, which was incredibly oriented around scientific materialism, box in mankind and its evolution. Humanity would be at a standstill. It would be only considering things with its intellect from a scientific perspective. And, we know where the atomic bomb got us with that. So they certainly had cause for this intense kind of feeling of emotion that they had that came up, and they decided we have to do something. And there were many groups, like I said, who had maintained this information, who were just like, hey, we're sitting on all this information. That's all we know how to do. Don't make us come out with it. We don't know what the rules are around that. We're good at secrecy. And there were other groups who got an incredible advantage by having this information stored, and yet other groups who said, you know what, it's not going to work because we're the keepers. We're going to keep this fine strain of information away from the mass of humanity because the mass of humanity will misuse it. And actually, it'll wind up in an upside-down situation where the worst people will use it and they'll have mastery over the good people. So all these different types of considerations were happening. So this is the period that we're looking into to that we're looking at, that we're kind of moving into the feeling of it. And I have to say, when we look at things like Ahriman and the Eighth Sphere, as I mentioned when we started, we can look at it journalistically and just cite the details, but there is a way in the anthroposophical point of view, in the theosophical point of view, for us to actually enter into this perspective so we truly understand the feelings and emotions that were going on. Because this kind of an episode, I'd say, would be a little bit different than figuring out how they organized massive secrecy around a space program. This one goes more to the heart and soul of how the spiritual movement around the world, how it's being repressed or how it's being distorted, and how it's been maintained over time as well. That's a totally different type of thing. And so in a way, we're all brave soldiers going in here because, it's a little bit different to consider things from the real deep spiritual perspective. That's different than analyzing a political movement. Although I've found over and over again, and one of the great reasons why I feel so comfortable going into the spiritual topics side by side with the political topics, over and over again, I find those characters and figures and forces and movements overlapping into each other, as we've demonstrated in these 13 episodes on the show. Now, I do want to mention here that this is episode 13 of the X series. And I want you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter so that you get informed of when these shows happen. That's important. And it keeps you and I in touch, because we're going to need to be in touch. There's only so much relying on social media networks that we can do. So make sure you do that. And the newsletter is free. It's something that keeps us up to date, and it keeps you informed of what's happening. The idea that these shows may at some point not be there in social media is quite real, as we've seen with many channels. So this is something, let's get smart and really make sure that we're both on the same page. And what will happen basically is very simple. You'll get an email about once a week in your inbox telling you what show's coming up, what guests we have on. Of course, in June, we have Catherine Austin Fitz, Joseph Farrell. I mean, some really incredible shows coming up. And so, it helps us kind of get in that groove with each other. And that said, how are we doing over there, Ms.
We are doing great.
Excellent. How are the questions coming in?
Everybody's raring to go.
So you're getting the impression that they're going to be able to lock into this Eighth Sphere with us.
Well, when we really get into it, the nitty gritty, we shall see.
Good point. I like the indecisiveness there. It's important. Don't be too committal yet. One of the things I want to start off with is Rudolf Steiner. Okay, Steiner originally comes in through writing bios of figures like Goethe. He's an incredible scholar, but he has an interesting past, which is that very early in his childhood, he had a number of psychic experiences. And he's helped along, interestingly enough, by an herbalist who's kind of like, supposedly an illiterate gardener. And it turns out that this man is connected with a Rosicrucian school, and that there's a master inside of this Rosicrucian school who's keeping an eye on Steiner as a boy and seeing, as we've noticed with people like Emma Britton, who I've brought up here a few times, and whose work I've spotlighted because I think she's a very important figure for bringing forward the information about the Orphic Circle. But one of the things she really told us is that these groups scan and keep an eye out and somehow have the ability to hone in on people with those types of abilities. And so we've seen these things happen over and over again. But with Steiner, it was quite unique because although he's a genius later, he was not such a good student when he started. And they were worried about him falling behind and all the rest. And what happened was they got him into geometry. And after geometry, his whole world opened up. He became an excellent student at school and all the rest. But he had unusual experiences. One of the experiences that he recounted was being in the house and seeing this woman come in and say that she needed help, and then she'd disappear into the oven. Very unusual, strange things. And he would find out later that it was a deceased relative who had died 10 years earlier from suicide using an oven. And so, we had this kind of strange series of events going on with Steiner, and he's troubled by it. And it's sort of like it gets to a point where he has an epiphany later about what it all meant, and it sort of collectively hits him all at once, and he rises to this other level, and then eventually this master contacts him directly. But all this takes place, he goes to school in Vienna. He becomes really the go-to scholar. He even shows up defending Friedrich Nietzsche, who was really, at that point in time, seeming like the crazy man of academia, and, just introducing all these wild concepts. And as he descended into a kind of madness, Steiner really stood up there, in his first kind of place of showing up on the map is just defending Nietzsche and writing articles to that effect. One of them you can still get out there, which is In Defense of Friedrich Nietzsche. So he has, while he's kind of developing all these academic credentials, and they are mighty, I can tell you he's one of the greatest scholars that we ever had, he starts to open up to this incredible mystical vision, and he has his own access there to the spiritual world. And when you think of the incredible legacy that Steiner left behind through anthroposophy, my God, biodynamic farming, eurythmy, there's a whole host of subjects that he went, far beyond just going into the deep spiritual aspects. He provided, all these different paths and doorways in so many different areas, as well as starting the Waldorf schools, of course, which we know are very innovative. They have very, very innovative methods for approaching childhood education. That's all Steiner. That is all Steiner. Now, here's a shot with Steiner and Annie Besant. And this is important. And it's one of a series of photos I'm going to show here. And Besant is very important because she is now, with the death of Helena Blavatsky, the leader of Theosophy. And she, although not having any of the mystical abilities of Blavatsky, is an incredible spokesperson, and comes out of these kind of labor movements in London, sticking up for underprivileged workers, women's rights, the right to vote, the right to home rule in India, the right to home rule in Ireland. I mean, this is an incredibly dynamic political individual. And as it turned out, Blavatsky picked her as her successor, and she grew the society, and she came into some controversies when they got to this idea of creating, a world teacher. But before that, she really saved Theosophy, because it was a real mess after Blavatsky died, and she really was a unifying factor. In fact, she came to be known as the driving force. So many of the things that we know about Theosophy came from Besant, and her partnership with Ledbetter, who also was somebody who rose with her after that whole period thereafter Blavatsky died. But her tight association with Steiner, who found her just incredibly noble and just felt she was so kind of on the right track, that friendship really made him one of the key people in Theosophy. And he chartered the entire German branch. I mean, he was really one of the most dynamic theosophical speakers. One of the interesting things we get into with Steiner is, you'd imagine, well, these people would go working together happily ever after and create this entire movement in the 20th century. But there's an incredible split that happens with Steiner and Besant, and it's over this Besant-Ledbetter project to create the world teacher through an Indian boy, Krishnamurti, who's an incredible teacher. But the whole idea of sort of forcing the issue of let's pray to the world teacher and bring one of these masters through a body and have it lead the world was too much for Steiner. And he started to see that Theosophy itself, the Theosophical Society, was becoming a plaything for all these different types of occult forces and marketing forces and everything else. From this very pure movement with these incredible details that Blavatsky brought forward, The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, which really completely blew away anything that was around at that time, and is really the foundation of the modern esoteric foundation. That stuff just didn't exist, and it came out of the mystery schools because she was involved with the mystery schools. So let's take a quick look at Blavatsky for a moment. Blavatsky, having this incredible psychic ability that she had, Steiner understood that she was the real thing. And this is very important because when you go into all these different movements and you try to size up who was real and who was not, you know, we get to this kind of foundation when we look at people like Steiner and we look at people like Besant and we look at Blavatsky. It's like these people form such a noble foundation for an esoteric tradition that the imitators and the people who came out of it and were working on very different purposes, or people who were working on really, you know, the kind of the wrong side of the fence. You know, there's a lot of people who are very washed away by history or just forgotten, and for good reason. And the thing is that there came a point with Theosophy, I think I should mention, where, you know, it was like it became an excuse to live in fantasy land. You know, it was kind of becoming like the Gaia TV of its day. And there was a distortion around it. It had been intentionally distorted because the truths that had come out, you know, as Steiner says, at its cradle stood true initiators. That's something that has to be really understood when we come to Theosophy. Theosophy contained some of the most important changes and breakthroughs, not only for itself as a spiritual society, but as I've traced in the series, it had such powerful ramifications and continues to. But if you look at historical events, you're going to find Theosophy. You know, I found them in the 1944 election. I found them with the vice president. You know, they're throughout all these different events. Gandhi, of course, is a theosophist. Besant helps promote Gandhi and make him what he is, and allows him, you know, the carte blanche to really lead this great movement. And, you know, so these people are very close with the historical achievements. So we're not talking about kind of a mild spiritualist fascination with seances. It's an entire movement that is well steeped in a kind of a fundamental social engineering, in a sense, and breaking free of the social engineering that's there. And I think that they're allowing a message to come through with their work, which is saying, look, you know, that there's so much more, and they're actually kind of shattering this paradigm. They're doing what they were supposed to do, what those mystery schools had wanted them to do, which was to break through this scientific materialism, that it was going to lock in everybody to this, completely shutting out a different side of their character so that their spiritual selves would never evolve. They were shutting down, in fact, all of mankind's spiritual progress by doing this. So the stakes were incredibly high. So let's take a quick look here. I'm going to read a quote about what Steiner had to say about Helena Blavatsky, and then we're going to get into what exactly he was doing. That is Madame Blavatsky, an incredible, truly incredible teacher, and, you know, just one of the kind of greatest channels for the masters and higher spiritual thought that we ever got. As a matter of fact, when Steiner recounts her history, he talks about how there hadn't been an individual like that in many thousands of years, if we think about that, which is quite incredible, which is that she had the ability, as they did in the older mystery traditions, to actually rise up out of herself into the spiritual realm and take the information and come back with it. You know, we associate that type of ability with some of the greatest prophets in history, for example, but we don't, you know, you don't expect so much of that, say, in the 19th century. That wasn't something that was heard about too much. Okay, so this is a quick overview by Steiner on Blavatsky, and it says, okay, so this then is the time in which Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's mission is situated. Without diminishing the size of her personality, one may well say the job assigned to her soul was actually too big for her. Absolutely. The mystery schools had sized her up and said, she's the one we can use, because the spiritualism movement is becoming a Frankenstein, and we really can't get that kind of thing going where, it seems like they've gotten hung up in this process with the idea of the afterlife is just like this life, which was exactly the wrong tack that they wanted to take in these circles. So let's go a little further with Steiner. He says, if we try to solve the riddle of why this particular woman was called to bring the message of theosophy to the world, here is what she offered. This is what we find. She offered the only possibility, the only channel through which the spiritual guides of Western humanity could communicate. Think about that. People in official positions at the time had not the least understanding about the spiritual realities needed by humanity. The very concept of spirit had been lost. Any talk of spirit had a hollow ring. She was the moment, such was the moment, when this remarkable woman, with her outstanding psychic spiritual gifts, was called from her youth to bring a message to the world. No scholar could do that for her. From the very beginning, she saw the world completely differently from the prescriptions of 19th century culture. From childhood, she could perceive spiritual beings in all that surrounds us. They were real to her as anything we touch with our hands. And one thing above all characterized her since her earliest youth: her great respect and reverence for, and her devotion to, sublime spirits. Without such devotion, no human being can attain knowledge, no matter how sharp a person's understanding, no matter what clairvoyant skills he or she may develop. There can be no true knowledge without this sense of devotion. It's a fascinating point, which is very often we find ourselves in this position of trying to develop techniques for connection and techniques for going in to deeper spiritual realms or understanding psychic matters and really, developing telepathy and all the rest of it. And what he's saying is that's a very small piece of the pie, that it is this understanding and relationship with these spirits. And it is a kind of an appreciation, a depth, a devotion to the spiritual world that can bring forth these incredible abilities and things. That's something that's important for us to remember when we're in the kind of era where everything is highly based around this sort of scientific intellectual efficiency method. And that's all very necessary in a lot of ways. But I think that one of the things that we need to explore is that Blavatsky is able to enter into the spiritual world. And that's really what we're getting. But I'll tell you another thing, which is Steiner does not give out compliments easily. He is not somebody who goes around saying, well, this person is a great psychic, or this person is a great clairvoyant, or this person's a great leader. I mean, he reserves that for the really heavy-duty people. And my feeling is that he understood, and really by observing, by being part of the society, he never actually met her because he came later. She died in 1891. And, his period really is around 1900 to 1909 with the Theosophical Society. And then he will go on to form Anthroposophy, which is a branch away from Theosophy. It's the same type of thing, and he understands the real Theosophical mission. But Anthroposophy is what he figures now, that Theosophy has become corrupted after the fact of Blavatsky dying. And although Besant saved it for a time, according to Steiner, and that he worked closely with her on that, by the time they get to 1909, it's become completely manipulated environment and intentionally sabotaged. We have to keep that in mind as we go along here. Let's get a picture of Steiner when he's first joining the Theosophical Society. I found this picture quite modern in a way. Let's take a look at that. This is a guy who could kind of show up with his own .com or something. I'll show you that one, Olivia. Check it out.
That's awesome.
But this is him. He's come out. He's an established scholar. He's got this connection with Nietzsche, and he's a highly spiritual individual. But he's very open-minded, and he's kind of latched on tightly to Theosophy. He's realized the great truth in there. Plus, he's had this incredible encounters over his life, and he's had his own connection with the masters. So really, when he's coming into this, he's to become Besant's European liaison in Germany. You know, he's the one who's leading the German chapter. He's so important. So, but this plan that gets hatched and the influence over people like Blavatsky, like Besant and Ledbetter, he feels is coming from these groups. Now, this is very important. Steiner specifies that at a certain point when these things were happening, that there were two sets of initiators who were looking at the situation. Remember earlier on, I said that there were groups who were looking at the situation and saying, we don't want our secrets to come out. And Blavatsky was the one bringing them out with the help of these 14 people who broke away from the mystery schools and said, we have to let this information out because the scientific materialism is going to box everybody in. So that's the nature of the situation. And what happens, though, is that when Blavatsky goes to America, having these abilities and understanding these secret societies and schools, she presents herself to them and says, gentlemen, I want to join with you. We're trying to kind of create a new paradigm here. We're moving into a new century. We all know what the stakes are. Let's go forward together. And they say, you're a woman. No dice. This is an all-male situation. And she says, but I'm a great exception because I'm doing all this stuff and I know what you know. So let's work together. And so she says, she kind of goes into this situation with them because she's determined to get into the heart of the mystery schools and work with them and bring the information out and coordinate it with them. Because after all, she has her own connection to these masters and all the rest of it. So they start to really get quite nervous about her because she seems like a loose cannon, and she is somewhat highly unpredictable. As much as she's advanced spiritually, she still has a regular personality of being kind of, pushy and loud and all the rest of it. So they've got this situation with her, and then she gives them an ultimatum, and she says, well, there is a mystery school in France. You know the branch I'm talking about. I will go to them, and I will, I'll join them, and I'll also give them your secrets. How would you like that? So she says, that's my kind of final offer. Let's work on this together. Let's build theosophy together. Let's have these mystery schools come out of the shadow in America. Now, the mystery schools in America were tightly connected with the political situation, according to Steiner. So we have to keep all that in mind. There's a lot of dynamics coming around by this kind of radical Russian woman coming on the scene and saying, let's share all the mystery school secrets with the rest of the world. They don't want this to happen. And what they do, according to Steiner, is quite fascinating. They place her in an occult imprisonment. And the way that works, it's a very interesting process, and I'll sum it up. Basically, they get a group of their best people together to create a massive thought form. And when Blavatsky's mental spiritual vision goes to rise to get the information that she gets when she's in those states, instead of getting there, she gets interfered with. She gets something that looks like the same place that she goes to for the information, when it in fact is these kind of three hardcore psychic drivers who are giving her this impression. And this is a kind of a dedicated process. And you'll see that after this process starts, a series of things happen to theosophy that really throw it into turmoil and get it off its game. It started off incredible. And she had done so much to build it up. Henry Olcott was the co-founder with her. He'd been associated with Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln comes up a lot, I want to say, in relation to this early period where the mystery schools are coming forward. And we're going to bring that up, and we're going to find some very unusual connections here. We've already found the Emma Britton connection with Lincoln, but this one goes even deeper than that. So, so basically, the sum of all this is that Blavatsky brings this information to a height with Isis Unveiled, brings the book out, starts the Theosophical Society, tries to join the mystery schools. The mystery schools say to her, you can't join, you're not a man. She threatens them. that they have to let her in anyway, and basically that they're being dinosaurs about the whole thing. And they decide, we're going to take our best people and we're going to form a ring around her consciousness. And so that's what they call occult imprisonment. And she goes into this entirely different state in her. She's basically under a massive psychic attack, I guess is the kind of most modern language that we could use for it. So it's a fascinating situation, and she sort of gets in and out of this imprisonment over time, which is why there's still good information that comes from Blavatsky during this period, which is after Isis Unveils comes out. But all kinds of distortions come out as well. So that's the nature of the situation as we come into Rudolf Steiner being at the helm of Theosophy, which is it's become, as a result of all this, and after Blavatsky dies, it's become a little bit more manipulated. It's become a little bit more bizarre, and it's become, it's become the kind of tool for different types of forces that just weren't there before. And all of this is a result of these mystery schools trying to force it back, kind of like put the genie back in the bottle. My God, she let all this stuff out. How do we get a handle on this again? Now, I will say to their credit that Theosophy opens up yoga, opens up meditation, opens up a cremation. They're making incredible strides even under these difficult situations. And there is a growing movement of intellectuals, academics, and all these other people getting on board. So it's going to be a serious challenge to commandeer this and really take it and spin it into a totally different area and make it a negative experience. But the forces that are working against Theosophy are powerful, because you have political groups, you have these secret societies, and you have the spiritual impulse that Steiner calls Ahriman, working to keep Theosophy out and have scientific materialism trump the entire scene. Because if scientific materialism can take over, then all of these forces get what they want, and we're going to go into their different goals as we get into it here. But before we go any further, I'm going to check in with Olivia to see how are you doing over there?
I'm doing great. Would you like a question right now?
Yes.
Well, it's off topic, but it is very current. Kathy Carr 207 says, do you think the recent suicides of Kate Spade and the chef have anything to do with mind control? And maybe we should just get into that and get it out of the way.
Well, it's too early to tell anything. It's awfully sad, I can tell you that. And, I don't think that we can apply anything in terms of analysis about what happened to those people. I just find it very strange. And I had pointed out to Olivia, actually, do you remember this? There was another fashion designer who's not so well known who had committed suicide the day before Kate Spade. So, it is quite unusual. And, that's the kind of thing we're just going to have to keep an eye on for sure. But I do feel that, when things come up in rapid succession, that it's always worth going a little extra into the details about what happened. But, things like that, what can we say? It's so terrible. And I hope all the people involved just, get through it, because you have a lot of different families and with these people. So, it's an interesting thing being a celebrity. It's often a two-edged sword. And I think that they found that out.
But we did find out that suicide rates are up 30% across the country since 1999.
Well, I see this as part of what they call the opioid epidemic. And one of the things that really bothers me about this also is that there's a massive move of the black budget into drugs on the other end. So you have this kind of confluence of forces. But I would say that it's interesting. It's to keep an eye on it. My guess is that a lot of those deaths are drug related. And, this is the kind of thing where, it kind of requires us to do a little bit better on the level of understanding, what are the influences of all these things that are around? How does the black budget go in and take over a place like Maine and turn so many people in Maine, in these cities, into heroin addicts? It's a massive thing. So we definitely are going to cover that. And it's funny, whenever we tackle spiritual subjects, the practical application of how you get this information, what it means, becomes so valuable, I would say. But But I can tell you this, that groups like Theosophy and Anthroposophy are so dedicated to the growth of society around ideas. You know, they were dedicated to things like the suffragette movement, civil rights, and home rule with these different countries. I mean, they're not sitting idly hoping that they get some kind of spiritual vision. They're very active, and in the middle of that activity, it seems to spurn their incredible spiritual growth. Absolutely. Do you have anything else?
That's pretty good for right now, I'd say.
Well, you're the boss. You know how it goes around here. So let's take a look at the eighth sphere for a moment, which is something that Steiner starts to mention. And he mentions it in relation to Ahriman. And that Ahriman's goal, and Ahriman being this force that he sees, long acquainted with humankind, a kind of lower astral force that he can identify. And when you get into this kind of vision, and when you do the types of things that these mystics do, like Steiner, like Blavatsky, you start to work with Akashic records, you start to get a higher vision, you start to go into states and be led by masters to information that will help you to understand the situation and the plight of humankind on Earth. And to get a feel, you know, your consciousness can go into these clairvoyant areas, and you start to demonstrate the abilities to see it. And, you know, it's an interesting thing about it because we all see it in different ways. I remember somebody in an Edgar Cayce reading asked him about Steiner. And they said, you know, is his idea of Atlantis correct? And he said yes, but he's looking at it, you know, it's like he's reviewing the information, this Akashic information, and this is his analysis, it's his breakdown of the information. So it's quite fascinating when you think about that, because each of us has a different way of how we would explain a particular thing. It's a kind of Rashomon effect, which is why we have so many different movements when people move their consciousness up a little bit. But I do think it's worth mentioning here that Steiner was not very much of a zealot. You know, he avoids that. He understands the incredible pitfalls, and he feels that the zealots are off balance spiritually and off balance mentally. You know, there's a number of things where he can kind of see that this type of approach, or being a true zealot, being over the top, being a kind of forceful personality or movement around these spiritual topics, or someone who's opportunist or, you know, taking advantage of them. These are things that he really stays away from, and he's not very preachy, I would say. It's a fascinating thing with Steiner. He's unusual because when you look at the different esoteric traditions, you do not find people who are of that scholarly level. I mean, this is someone who had an incredible education, but his own gifts and inclinations. You know, we get incredible information from people like Blavatsky, but she could not articulate her ideas as well as somebody like Steiner, I would say. You know, that Besant had the incredible ability to do that also, but she didn't have the great mystical vision. So it's a very interesting combination of forces in these different people. But Steiner's unique in that he can tell you, he can break it down why it's important. And don't get me wrong, there are certain aspects of Steiner's work which are completely abstract and take years to decipher. I made a joke with Olivia. I said that, you know, the better the translation, the more difficult it is to understand what he's saying. But I do feel like when we take it in the full picture, in the kind of, you know, well-rounded holistic picture that he gives, we get kind of the best idea of these esoteric themes that you can find, because he's looking at it from a mental level, a spiritual level, a psychological level, and he is kind of integrating these into the picture that he's giving us. So that's definitely something that we need. You know, we need that extra look. So there are a lot of different impressions of this eighth sphere. Let's take a look. This is actually, Steiner did these incredibly simple drawings. Let's take a look at this. Now we can see this. We kind of get the idea. I think the further away that one is, the better. But on the very bottom here is interesting. This is what Steiner has denoted as the eighth sphere. This is an evolutionary track for humanity. And we're looking at the Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, Jupiter, Venus, and Vulcan. These aren't representations just of planets. They're representations of evolutionary stages. So the Vulcan level, which is funny because, of course, we all know Vulcans in Star Trek, comes right out of this research. The Vulcan level that he's referring to is a future realm of evolution for humanity. It doesn't exist yet to us physically, but we're moving into that. And this is the process that Ahriman and this group, these entities, these lower astral entities, are trying to prevent. And by moving mankind into this scientific materialism, by moving them into this narrow way of perceiving their own being, they get them there a lot quicker. Let's put it that way. The eighth sphere is connected with the Earth. And one of the interesting ways of looking at it is, Steiner said, you can always tell the level of how the eighth sphere is getting closer in with the Earth, because there's a kind of epidemic of insanity that was taking place there around the turn of the century, 18th into 19th. And by the time they get to World War I, he's like, this is like a total eighth sphere situation, because when these Ahrimanic forces move in, they spread chaos, and that's the nature of the situation. And this is an interesting idea, the epidemic of insanity. I want us to keep that phrase in mind. This image might give us an idea. We see the Earth itself, and then around it is this force. It's not a fully formed physical planet. It's a realm around the planet. And the idea from Steiner's perspective is that the thoughts, the imaginations, the feelings, the fantasy life of the human beings are being commandeered and drained over into this eighth sphere. Now, he got that through in-depth study, and what happened was he said that it was such a big secret in esoteric circles, in those mystery schools, that it wasn't something that he even was going to bring out initially. But what happened was there was someone who was in Theosophy named A.P. Sinnett, who was this, he was actually a banker, but he developed this relationship with Blavatsky, and he started to have these kind of mystical impressions, and he started to work with clairvoyant material and meet these masters and all the rest of it. Well, it turns out, in Steiner's way of looking at it, that the masters that were working with Sinnett and giving him this information, which came out in a book called Esoteric Buddhism, which basically is the entire opposite direction from where Steiner wanted to go. But Esoteric Buddhism had the section in it on the eighth sphere, and this came out of that mystery school kind of block thing. Once they blocked Blavatsky, the next thing to do was to spread this information out there and to get people off the real trail. This is Steiner's impression. So he writes about the eighth sphere. He lets out one of the big esoteric circle secrets. And then instantly Steiner jumps into it and says, well, the eighth sphere basically is fundamentally the opposite of everything that Sinnett put out about it. Sinnett is under the influence of these groups that took over Blavatsky's vision and put her in this kind of imprisoned state. So what's interesting about all this is the eighth sphere, in Steiner's version, is thus. It's something where when we are kind of put into a fantasy state that our evolutionary track is interfered with, and that there are groups like the Ahrimanic group that controls this lower astral realm, who have a great interest in keeping us in that fantasy state. And when I say fantasy state, it is this state of seeing things in a false manner. So very often we see a lot of this now coming out of Hollywood, for example. There's an incredible fantasy-driven thing there. We see all this access to our minds directly through the 5G entrainment that gets used. We see suggestion being used. This is a very transhumanist push. And in Steiner's view, the Ahrimanic, this is their direction, basically. Now, let's just take a look at, in his work, why they would do this. The idea is that they are thinking of themselves as their own evolutionary track. They don't want the evolutionary track for the human being to go the way that it would go, because their sway, their power over the human, the entire humanity, the progress of humanity, would be diminished once we achieve our own evolutionary track. They wouldn't have that power anymore to engage us on all these different levels the way that they do and capture our imagination, capture our spirit. So what's fascinating about these forces and these groups is Steiner is not of the opinion that we need to shun them or, kind of run for cover. The idea is to engage them, but kind of not surrender your power. This is the kind of most simple, straight ahead way I could describe it. But we're going to get into exactly what his quotes were about it. But the eighth sphere is important because what happens is the track that it puts you on delivers you into this realm. As a matter of fact, as we know, when you get to theosophy and anthroposophy, they deal with the reincarnation track, which is we go through a certain process here on Earth, and then we go through a different type of process when we're in the afterlife. And the afterlife brings us into these different experiences, and then we come back to the Earth as a new incarnation and move forward. So this is the nature of the situation that comes together when we're talking about traditional esoteric understanding. Reincarnation is a big part of it. But the eighth sphere works like this too, because if you can hijack somebody's consciousness the way that Ahriman desires to on Earth, then when they die, when they go into that afterworld, they don't take the normal evolutionary track and then come back and reincarnate. They go through the eighth sphere instead. So they stay even in the afterworld in this dulled state that is under the control of these lower astral forms. And they come back here and they're, instead of assuming their normal evolutionary track, they're going through this. This is the fundamental kind of basic premise of Steiner with Ahriman and the eighth sphere. Now, it is interesting that the eighth sphere slipped out. I want to tell you about a little research I did around the eighth sphere, which is interesting because we have Steiner on record and Sinnott on record saying this, had never been let out before and these mystery schools had kept it. Well, it's very odd, but there was a series of cards that were made, and they were made after the fashion of tarot cards, but it's stressed very heavily when we look back at them that they actually were not. They're called Montagna Tarocchi. And did I get that right, Olivia?
I say it again?
Montagna Tarocchi?
Yes, that's right.
All right, sounds good. Okay, the complete set is a humanistic model of the Renaissance cosmos, supposedly. They're saying, oh, they're not tarot cards, they're not for games, they're not for fortune telling. There is this very unusual set of cards that came out of Italy. And they actually include the estates, the stations of humanity and society. And although similar to tarot or normal playing cards, they are presumed to be educational tools for upper-class children of the period. Very, very unusual. But they were kept differently. They were kept away. They didn't become the common property of the tarot card. The people who were kind of doing those for games or for divination or whatever it happened to be. So I found the eighth sphere in those cards, which is quite interesting, especially since this is from the 14th century. Let's take a look at some of these. Octava Aspera, that is the eighth sphere there. This person is holding it. And I would think that any kind of normal person who's familiar with tarot would think that looks like a tarot card to me, but it's fascinating this whole separate set of cards existed. But what's more important is what are they doing talking about the eighth sphere in the 14th century when Sinnott and Steiner said, well, it's one of the ultimate secrets that are kept. So if we go a little bit deeper into that, we're going to find some other things associated with these. Here's actually another version of it, a little more defined, let's say. This is the eighth sphere. card. It's actually called that directly. So there's no possibility for misinterpretation. So if this great esoteric secret just exists here and is put out in these 14th century cards, who put it there, and what is the nature of it? Because anyone, of course, who was a master esotericist and in these mystery schools would know, hey, the eight sphere is our biggest secret. What is it doing out here? So if we go a little bit deeper in those cards, it gets even more interesting. Let's try this. I've got some really great pictures tonight, and this is interesting. Now, for those of you familiar with Masonic imagery, we know the compass is really fundamental foundation. Well, here is this character holding the eighth sphere over here. Let's see if we can do that. And right beside her is someone holding the Masonic compass with a different globe. Now, if we get a little bit deeper into the symbolism of these cards, we start to see some very deep esoteric trends in them that I think are going to answer a lot of questions for us. This one is quite unusual. And again, let me try this. Mantegna Tarocchi. Okay, so that's the name of the cards for you to look them up. And I'll spell it for you, actually, because they are quite fascinating. This is Mantenya. No, actually, Mantegna. TAR. I'm going to start that again. Mantegna. And then TAROCHI. That's the name of them. So I would actually encourage everyone to look up these cards. They are fascinating. Let me tell you, they get right to the heart of everything that we're talking about here. Let's take another look at this. This is quite unusual. This is their card, supposedly for the sun. And you've got this woman in a chariot, this angel, carrying a head, a scorpion, and a child heading for, it looks like, being dumped off for the river. Now, I want to kind of compare that with a few quotes that I have from Steiner and get back to what these cards represent and how they had this information 5 centuries before Steiner even brought it up, and how he said it was the biggest secret, and here it is. Because this gets really to the heart of what we're talking about. So let's try this out. Olivia, how are you doing over there?
I'm doing great.
That's so good to hear. Let me tell you. You've been doing excellent. Of course, everyone, I want to encourage you while I'm reading this to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Keep us in touch with each other. That's the kind of thing where, it's the most basic track for us to stay in touch with each other. I can tell you that there's so many different ways. You can always check our Facebook page, facebook.com/darkjournalist. You can go to twitter.com/darkjournalist. Those things are there. We will carry the information. But the best way, the most complete way, is for us to exchange that. And I'm going to have Olivia put up that link now so you all have it. And, it's an interesting thing because there was a stat there. There were a number of people as we were looking through the chat, and we found that, some of the people in the chat weren't even signed up for the YouTube channel. I don't know how that works. So, make sure that you're in. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the newsletter, keep us in touch with each other, basically. That's the best way to do it. Let's take a look at a few quotes from Steiner about the eighth sphere. Quote, this is Steiner. What Lucifer and Ahriman would love to do is to be able to take the wisdom of the gods, lock, stock, and barrel, and transfer it to the eighth sphere through humanity. So they want to kind of take our spiritual heritage and transfer it into this field that they commandeer, which is it has physical aspects, but we're talking about a realm that they've developed. More quotes. If everything were to run without a hitch for Lucifer and Ahriman, if they were everywhere able to rest as much as they rest from the organ of the head, Earth evolution would soon reach a point where Lucifer and Ahriman could succeed in destroying the Earth and in leading overall evolution of worlds into the eighth sphere. So they're talking the entire evolutionary process would now come through them and what they've set up in the eighth sphere. Now, I want to make a point here, which is that when Steiner mentions Ahriman in the same breath with Lucifer, he considers Ahriman the actual devil. So this is something that gets caught up in the language in this period, because there was this whole movement about identifying things for what they were. And what happened was, when Steiner was writing about Goethe and all the kind of nature revelations that Goethe had, he realized that in Faust, Goethe had misidentified and had combined Lucifer in with Ahriman, and that was the devil. But he actually said there are two different halves here that are operating. So we'll get a little more into that, but just keep in mind that it's, for our purposes of looking at the eighth sphere, it's largely Ahriman is what the main danger is, and Lucifer working with Ahriman is bad news as well. As we go into this very, very kind of mystical information around the eighth sphere, let's go even further. So he's saying that they could lead the entire evolutionary track, all of these beings, humanity and all the rest of it, right through their eighth sphere idea. The eighth sphere is something which we see here is fantasy very often, comes up in largely selfish motives, scientific reality, scientific arrogance, mechanization, transhumanism. This is all this kind of movement for it. It's a kind of arrogance away from our true nature for humanity. It's a totally different evolutionary track. And it's one that's being rolled out quite well now. I think we see it often, and it's unfortunate. It's something that's really getting quite an upper hand at this point in the 21st century. Okay. So he's saying here that the overall evolution of worlds they would take through the eighth sphere, so that the Earth evolution as a whole would take a different course. Hence, Lucifer and Ahriman endeavor to unfold the greatest strength of all at the place where man is most vulnerable, namely in his head. Now, this is fascinating because the whole thing is about the head. We know this is where the third eye is. We know this is where the field of vision is. We know this is where the psychic aspects operate from. This realm that's been targeted by Ahriman is the head of humanity. So let's think about, let's get another kind of quote around this. The stronghold which is easiest for them to capture is the human head, and everything that is similar to the head in respect to the distribution of the mineral element, so that it can be drawn out in the same way, is equally exposed to the danger of being dispatched into the eighth sphere. No less a prospect looms as a consequence of this intention of Ahriman than the whole evolution of humanity may be allowed to disappear into the eighth sphere, so that this evolution would take a different course. So from his spiritual viewpoint, looking at this, he sees this as the ultimate danger, that Ahriman and Lucifer have combined forces after being opposing forces, and that Ahriman is the force that's very connected with the earth and very connected with the technology, and this is his entire realm, his force as a lower astral being, and that Lucifer lends itself to incredible imaginations, fantasies. You have this epidemic of people with these fantasies around these different sites and websites. They're kind of living in this virtual reality. That is pure Luciferian. And what's interesting is that one of the things that Steiner points out is that at certain points in our history, those things actually helped us to develop our thinking process, and that things like speech came from our interaction with these higher beings. But that this combination of Ahriman and these Luciferic forces cause us to our entire evolutionary process to be in great danger. This is what we're seeing when you get into things like the space fence, when you get into things like the control of the economic system, it's such a domination of humanity that it's working at the behest of a larger force. That's kind of the key, I would say, for this. Let's go a little further with Steiner. As I stated in the second public lecture called The Social Future, which is from October 25th, 1919, it's a very important lecture. One can only wish that if it were followed up on in all details, it would then be seen how fundamentally true these things are. But just because this rulership of the mere symbol for solid goods, that is to say money, has arisen, Ahriman has been given another essential medium for the deception of mankind. If men do not realize that the rights state and the organism of the spirit must be set against the economic order called up through the economists and the banks, then again, through this lack of awareness, Ahriman will find an important instrument for preparing his incarnation. His incarnation is undoubtedly coming, and this lack of insight will enable him to prepare it triumphantly. So that's kind of a bad state of affairs, and he's indicating that the economic environment of 1919 is highly Ahrimanic. That is, when it's so funny because when I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, my God, this could have been written in 2018. We're in the entire field of vision of what he was seeing. I've always had the impression with Steiner's work that he could see backwards and forwards quite well, and that when he's looking into the great epochs of Atlantis and all the rest of it, that his future vision is equally as good. And so there's something kind of timeless, but really ahead of his time about his work. And over again, I think we encounter it. Let's take a look at what he has. Now, one of the interesting things, and I said that Steiner was somebody who really applied himself, was he was an incredible sculptor. And let's take a look at his sculpture of Ahriman. This is what he got in his field of vision when he developed his whole look for Ahriman. This is the cover using the same one of his book, which is the French version of his Incarnation of Ahriman book. Let's take a look at that there. So we're getting the impression, it's the devil basically, but it does have this kind of extra feature, I would say. This is a picture of Ahriman in Persian mythology. He's the Chimera. And there's a few interesting things that are happening here. Ahura Mazda, who's the hero in the Zoroastrian religion, is stabbing him in his abdomen. And he also has grabbed his horn. So both of his hands are occupied, and Ahriman is still coming at him. So it's a tremendous battle that they're engaged in. And I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the imagery that they're drawing on when Steiner is talking about Ahriman, it's kind of interesting because, there are so many names for the devil, Beelzebub, Baal, Belial, all these different names. He's focusing in on Ahriman. He's been trying in his 3 or 4 decades of going into these spiritual subjects. He's trying to explain this figure to us and what is going on with it. This figure is his life's work, really, when you get right down to it, informing humanity about what this is, not just in a kind of a superstition fear, but what is it? What does it want? What's happening here? This is what's been missing so much in the regular religious traditions, which is the why. You get a lot about what to do, but the reasons for doing it or what's behind it, and they've been dealing with a different kind of situation and a different type of priority, you might say. But, and they've done some things good and some things not so good. But I do think that what we get with Steiner, when you're dealing with this idea of these forces, these lower astral forces commandeering human evolution, and that we can tie that directly into the economic order and the transhumanism that we see, we get a much better understanding for what these people and what these forces are about. And that helps us to combat them in the grand scheme of things. Okay, let's go even further. Now, you remember that Steiner said it was the head that was being targeted by Ahriman because the head contains the clairvoyant ability. It is the single focus of this. The other thing I think that's interesting to consider about what he said there is, if you go further in the quote, he talks about how what they want is the mind, the thoughts, the impressions, the fantasies, the clairvoyant vision. They want to take that into the eighth sphere with them, speaking on a very, kind of mystical level with you here. And so he kind of muses in the middle of the lecture and says, what would happen actually is that they would take the evolution of the head, and again, speaking mystically, it would be a torso of humanity that would evolve into the next stage on this mystical level, because when he's looking at it, he's saying, what they're after is the mental faculty, the psychic vision, all of these different things. So when he's looking at it, he's saying the being that would arise out of there would be well developed, it would be physically evolved in all these different ways, but its mental capacity would have been taken over into this eighth sphere and given over into this entire process of fantasy and serving this lower astral set of beings. Now, when we go back to those very interesting cards, Montaigne Tarocchi, we see that there's this child heading for the river here. This strange angel here has a head. It's holding a head. Let's see if you can see that. And we see a scorpion up there. Basically, this picture is unusual because what it tells me is that something's wrong if this is supposed to be the sun and the angel. It's got a magic head, and the body of this child appears to be headed for the ground, and then there's a scorpion up top, and scorpions were pretty negative symbols here. So I think if we look through these cards, we've seen that the eighth sphere existed there. It looks to me like they're also giving us this impression that the vision, the thoughts, the mind of humanity is at stake in the battle with Ahriman. This is what they're laying down because, of course, whoever was creating these cards was laying out what Steiner himself and what Sinnett himself said was basically the biggest esoteric secret at that time, which is the eighth sphere. So if they're letting that out, obviously something else is coming out in here as well, and it ties in directly with what he said. All right, so let's move this into what else is what are the mystery schools doing around the eighth sphere? What is the nature of letting that out? What happens once that first part gets out? And then when we see Steiner respond to it, we can see what he said about it. So he let it out. We have two people letting the secret out, plus the card makers. Okay. In 1893, a very unusual book shows up of these series of lectures. This totally unknown person who supposedly was 38 years old shows up out of nowhere, gives these incredible esoteric wisdom lectures, and basically drops out of the scene. His name was C.G. Harrison. And, they have this title in this book. It's called Transcendental Universe. This is the book. And when I was joking with Olivia earlier, I said they should have called it basically latest report on the Mystery School War because this book is so advanced in terms of what the guy says, but he's speaking on that level that Steiner is working on. I almost wonder, although I can't find it in the record, if there isn't collusion with him and Steiner. But I want to read something that he says because, of course, he talks about Blavatsky's occult imprisonment also, one. But two, he talks about the War of the Mystery Schools, like he's right on the front lines and what it's all about. And he brings in a lot of traditional things like Catholicism and all the rest of it, but I'm not going to go into that. So you might remember the story that I told you earlier about Steiner talking about Blavatsky and how she goes to this mystery school and how they basically tell her you're not a man and all the rest of it. So let's read this now. This is C.G. Harrison. The book is Transcendental Universe. And it says, quote, under the circumstances, the spiritualists could not be undeceived as to the source of their inspiration. There was no alternative but to withdraw from the experiment. You remember earlier we were talking about these mystery schools helping people like the Fox sisters, and they were bringing in this whole realm and understanding of what happens after we die. And they were bringing in really a kind of fascinating level of understanding of let's communicate back and forth. And people who were in the next world, you know, it's like near-death experience, afterlife experience. We do the same thing now. We have shows that are dedicated to it. So he's talking about this the same exact way, with almost the same exact terms as Steiner. Let's go further. So he says they had to withdraw from the experiment, like Steiner said. They back away, and what they eventually do is they find Blavatsky. Okay, but let's see what he says. But the mischief was done. The door had been opened to extra-mundane influences that could not be reclosed. Spiritualism was a Frankenstein monster and a Proteus into the bargain. Mediumship, especially in America, became a profession. And mediums, subject to every kind of psychic influence, were largely exploited by brothers of the left for their own purposes. Now, this is interesting. Brothers of the left, brothers of the right, they decide when talking about this that they need to use political terms. So they're not saying left liberal, right conservative, but they figured out, okay, we have to talk about these two groups who are separated. The brothers on the right, they think, let's push this out. The brothers on the left, who are the vast majority, are saying, no, you can't have this information come out, whatever you do. So the brothers of the left are basically intentionally sabotaging the spiritualist movement. Let's go further. And again, we're in the Transcendental Universe with C.G. Harrison. Very unusual figure who just basically comes out, does these lectures, and disappears. A deep mystery school actor, no question about it. The brothers of the left, the party of secrecy, were almost wholly employed in endeavoring to counteract these influences with the assistance of many who called themselves liberals. Quite a new name, by the way. When an event occurred which united both parties in defense against a common danger, a person who was known to exist, but who had not yet been discovered, suddenly appeared in Paris, presented herself at an esoteric lodge, and demanded admission into the brotherhood on terms which could not be entertained for a moment. She then disappeared, and the next thing that was heard was that a certain Madame Blavatsky had been expelled from an American brotherhood for an offense against the Constitution of the United States. So this is very interesting. This guy is expressing everything in very political terms, liberal, conservative, right, left, and all the rest of it. But this is how they decided to discuss the mystery school battle, because they figured people on reading this could understand it. So the idea that she created an offense against the Constitution of the United States, if we're to translate, means the Constitution inside those mystery schools. She did something by demanding probably to be admitted, even though she was a woman. She's violating their Constitution. Okay, let's go forward. She had gone to British India in order to carry out a certain threat, which it would seem there was a fair prospect of her putting into execution. I'm going to spill your secrets. It is only within the last few months that I learned the details of this Homeric struggle in which poor Madame Blavatsky played the part of Patroclus in the armor of Achilles. She spread consternation at first, but was soon metaphorically slain, or rather taken prisoner. Then it was then that the real battle began. So he is now going into this occult imprisonment that we referred to with Blavatsky order earlier. And this is the battle of the mystery schools that we're describing. It was here that the real battle began, and for several years raged around her unhappy personality. He puts a lock on it. He calls it several years. That's helpful, because a lot of people thought it went all the way until she died. But as I am not at liberty to make unrestricted use of the information I received, the best way I will I can do this is to read you an extract from a report which I drew up at the time with the view of putting it in the hands of newspaper readers in the form of an interview. In order to make them more easily comprehended, I used political terms like liberal, conservative, coalition, ministry. So he's telling us how he's describing these kind of mystery school things. So he goes deep here into exactly what took place. Now, what's fascinating is that is so close, of course, to what Steiner was giving us earlier about how she had been imprisoned. And he does go in depth here about the aspects of heaven at the time of the birth of Madame Blavatsky frightened the conservatives, which resulted in a kind of coalition ministry, which gave place to a liberal one in the year 1841. A brother of the left revealed this fact to Madame Blavatsky in Egypt about 20 years ago. Now, this is 1893, so this is 1873 he's talking about. And she returned to Europe immediately and imposed certain terms as a condition of reception into an occult brotherhood, which were indignantly refused, that she had subsequently received in America, and she was expelled shortly afterwards. In consequence of a threat from Madame Blavatsky that she would soon make the American Brotherhood shut up shop, a conference of American and European occultists was held in Vienna. A particular course of action was decided upon. During the time Madame Blavatsky imagined herself to be in Tibet, which is, this is her going in this astral state and going into these different states to get information. So when she goes into this state, he's saying she was in reality at Kathmandu in the state known to occultists as in prison. That certain Hindu occultists who, for patriotic reasons, having sided with her against the American Brotherhood, had nearly succeeded in procuring her release from prison, by their own efforts, consented to a compromise whereby she was to be set free on condition of their non-interference with anything that had already been accomplished. He's saying here that Kudhumi was a real person, but that these groups put together a kind of a false Kudhumi to communicate with her and give her wrong information. So this is the level of the battle being described in this book. And the Mystery School battle, as we know, continued on when we got to Besant and hiding the Keeley information and all the rest of it. But this is the foundation of everything that we're talking about, because this battle over having the information out leads us to, inevitably, this idea of the eighth sphere. The eighth sphere being the place that this harmonic force is adopting in the Steiner language. It's adopting it as a realm of capturing our imagination, of capturing our impressions, things we hope for the future, our psychic impressions, our ability to project, in fact. So in Steiner's setup, what it is really, this is an alternative future. It's an alternative track of evolution that is completely wrong and completely backward for spiritual evolution. But these groups have the ability to cause this to happen. And the greatest fear, the greatest thing that Steiner has to say in relation to Ahriman is that Ahriman would come upon mankind unawares. So this is why he dedicates those 3 decades of his life. Basically, although he does all this stuff building anthroposophy out, the hardcore center of it is this battle with Ahriman. And the problem is that this Ahrimanic force makes evolution, it makes it seem like this process is taking place because you're on this kind of pleasure ride and you're getting technological toys and you are in this economic system. And, it's everything that we've seen in our modern culture that is promoted. But it has to take the fundamental spiritual side of it out, because none of those things would have the value that they have in a society like today. The combination of the transhumanist push that we've seen in the 21st century, for the robot bartenders, and that we're moving into this robotics period where they're trying to replace humanity, where they're trying to confuse things like even the ability to say what gender you are. They just want to eliminate that threat that humanity is. And they can do it all with service with a smile. This is basically what we're getting at with Steiner's vision of what the Ahrimanic forces are doing. But now with the eighth sphere, if that was such a hotly kept secret in these circles, now we kind of understand why, in a sense, because if people understand that they're being lulled into this fantasy and that, it's not going to work anymore. It's like any illusion. You break it when you wake up. So putting us in this kind of dream state that's taking place with the internet, with entertainment, and with the high-tech ability of 5G and all the rest of it, gives these forces, these lower astral forces that Steiner refers to as Ahriman, the ability to basically commandeer our evolutionary process. So what happens when that takes place is we don't get to the evolutionary jump that we are made for, that we're here for. So the War of the Mystery Schools taking place in this context, one of the mystery groups is saying, look, scientific materialism is going to take them down. They're all going to end up in the eighth sphere. What's the point of keeping the secrecy? In 100 years, we won't even recognize humanity. The group that is there to preserve the chance, basically, for humanity to develop in the right way is saying, we don't care. We have to let all the secrets out. Now, it's a very interesting thing because Steiner himself, at a certain point, there's another shot of Steiner. He arrives at the opinion during World War I, where he says, what's happening is this. Basically, theosophy and anthroposophy have failed because World War I is here. We didn't get the message out. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to commandeer these things. The spiritual backlash was supposed to blow away the whole war situation. And with his vision, he must have seen World War II coming fast on the heels of that. So he said, you know what? All my lectures that are supposed to be to the kind of special group, let them go. Let them out to the public. It's the inside group stuff. I'm going to do my own version of letting the mystery school information out. And he lets out these incredible lectures where we find out all these things about Ahriman and all the rest of it, a lot of which were really vouchsafed for those inside members of anthroposophy and his older, when he worked in theosophy. He decides, you know what? We can't do it. We can't hold on to the information. We can't wait. Put the stuff out. But he says, so they're worried about it, inside anthroposophy. And he makes a statement. He says, don't worry. This whole push that came from theosophy and is rising through anthroposophy is going to get an opportunity in 100 years to do the whole thing all over again. Now, he makes the statement in 1916. And the period that he pegs for it is this 2016 period. It's a different 100 years. So his point of view is that for some reason the door opens again, the mystery schools get an opportunity again to move the culture out of this transhumanist Ahrimanic vibe and into the right evolutionary track. So this is the period that we're in. They've played out the first hand. They played out the first round. They had some successes, like Gandhi. They had some really huge failures, like letting the Theosophical Society dissolve into some idol worship around some world teacher. So it tells us where the battle resides now. And that, I think, is absolutely crucial. And one thing I want to make sure that we cover before we move along to Olivia. How are you doing over there, Olivia?
Doing great. I got so many questions.
Unbelievable. Well, the whole second part of the show, we're going to take questions. We'll just take a couple minutes here and give you the final quotes on this from Steiner. And, of course, I keep mentioning Annie Besant. You're going to find as we do these shows, I cannot emphasize the following characters to you more in this entire drama of humanity playing out over the past 150 years. Rudolf Steiner, Annie Besant, Emma Britton, Helena Blavatsky, Edgar Cayce, and P.D. Ouspensky. When we look at their work collectively, of course, Nikola Tesla and John Keeley as well. And there are a number of political groups. I'm speaking more of the spiritual side. This individual, we're going to find, did something very interesting in relation to the X technology not getting in the wrong hands. And it's absolutely crucial, the role that she played. She also is the one who coached Gandhi with India Home Rule. And I've shown those pictures before of her with Gandhi, and we know that Gandhi. So if you think of the incredible things that she achieved through theosophy and, the whole battle of running an organization in the wake of such an incredible person like Blavatsky, I mean, who among us could have done a better job? It's hard really to imagine. So before we get into the final quotes, let's do this. The invasion of scientific materialism, we got to that. Yeah, well, there's this whole thing about Cain and Abel, but we're going to put that into a different show, actually, because we're going to do another one of these. Now, but one thing I wanted to show you just briefly, it's very unusual, and I mean unusual. Remember how the cards were unusual earlier? Because they're not supposed to exist, right? Talking about the eighth sphere openly and all the rest of it. Well, this guy, Henry Winter Davis, is an unusual guy. He's very close to Abe Lincoln, and he's a congressman from Maryland. Very serious guy. And you might look at his background and you think, okay, he's close to Lincoln, Henry Winter Davis, let's see, U.S. representative, prominent Episcopal clergyman was his dad. He sounds like a kind of a good, solid character from that period. Then, out of the blue, when you're looking at this, one of his most famous things is that he penned an elaborate political work entitled The War of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. But he penned it in 1853. So he starts using Ahriman as this force coming in to reshape America in the wrong way. But he's not with Steiner in 1909 with anthroposophy. He's in 1852. Where is he getting the information? What mystery school is he belonging to, working side by side with Abe Lincoln? Certainly, we understand Lincoln's deep, deep attraction to spiritualism. We have him doing seances when his son passes away. We have Emma Britton doing speeches for him. How does this guy know about Ahriman? Ahriman is there in Persian mythology, but this is kind of an unusual thing for this congressman to be picking up and writing about. So let's see. Let's take a quick look at his book here, just so we're all on the same page. There it is. Ahura Mazda, and the War of Ormuzd and Ahriman in the 19th century, the modern Quixote and Squire Sancho. This is so interesting, this book. And the book opens in 1852 talking about 4 and all this stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, God, this sounds like the Gettysburg Address. And there's more language in there exactly like that. So this guy talking about Ahriman, working with Abe Lincoln, and then thinking about the American school having such a problem with Blavatsky because she's going to let these secrets out, and the kind of, putting her in occult imprisonment and all the rest of it. And then Steiner coming along and saying, well, you know what? It's Ahriman that is the real threat. And this guy talking about how Ahriman is basically invading America in 1852. Combination of these things gives us that political backbone, the understanding that the political groups are working side by side with the secret societies. And that the secret societies, we've got, according to Harrison earlier, when I was reading his very unusual lecture, he's saying, look, you've got these left-hand brothers and you have the right-hand brothers. And it's the right-hand brothers who are trying to bring this information out, and the left-hand brothers who are either keeping it for themselves or using it actually, just addicted to the secrecy around it. So are we looking then at Abe Lincoln as working with the right-hand stuff because he's talking about Ahriman here? It's getting very interesting when we get into it. We can't understand the situation that we're in the 21st century with the range of issues that we have going on with the technological problems with the technological domination, with the small domination of a group that meets at Davos every year. These things, the larger picture, I'm telling you, I've looked at it deeply. In my opinion, without understanding the exsteganography that brings us into the realm of seeing the war of the mystery schools in these groups, we can't get anywhere. The reason that we've been missing it, and all these brilliant people have come forward, and here's been this great book and that great book, it does not coalesce and come forward into something that we can use to change the culture, because they're missing these important facts. The war of the mystery schools, absolutely crucial fact. The exsteganography is undeniable. Look at the 13 episodes of the exsteganography. The groups working to keep the X technology hidden and out of the hands of the wrong people on the good side, and the corporate forces looking to get their hands on the X technology and suppress that technology from the public and use it for their own ends. This is the nature of the situation that we find ourselves in. That's what the nature of the show is all about. When I go into these issues as dark journalists looking at these things, the dark journalism I'm looking at is loaded with political corruption on one hand. On the other hand, it's loaded with secrecy around issues like the UFO file. So when we're starting to put these things together and where those worlds basically meet up, when you and I are talking about something like chemtrails, it's a much bigger, we go into a much bigger field when we understand the context of who's behind the battle. That's the place that we need to go to with this information. That's what's going to make the difference in the long run. And with that, I will turn everything over to Olivia. But before that, I want to say that Rudolf Steiner's movement is anthroposophy. Steiner gave us the key, and it's a great salute to his work, just like Besant's work. And let's remember to take a look at them, because in the final analysis, they did the job. They set up the 100-year opportunity, and here it is. And there they are working together at that point in time, and this is the great impact that they've had. Now the point is, can all the information that they've brought forward, can it be used? Is this something that we can use to change the paradigm in the 21st century so that these forces don't have the upper hand? That's the question that you and I are pursuing in looking at the exsteganography and looking at the mystery school wars. This is where it's taking us. That's where the research has led us. And that's a question that we're going to try to answer as we progress in doing these shows. And that's why it's great that we're doing these things together. So Olivia, with that, I turn it over to you.
Okay, are you ready? Because there's lots of questions.
Okay.
Okay, Magi Cicada, does DJ think the eighth sphere could be Planet X?
Yeah, well, I'm starting to really get the impression that this might be what we're talking about, because over and over again, the eighth sphere, it looks like Planet X was something that they theorized back in the 19th century, because they were getting the impression that there was a mass out there, but they couldn't get a real handle on it. And this seems to be something that appears and then disappears in a physical reality. And what Steiner seemed to be saying about it was not completely physical, that it was a realm that was in development. So, it's funny, because the very nature of humanity, we think of things in very concrete physical terms, but we do a number of things that have nothing to do with the physical reality, including dreams, right? We're going into a very intangible state when we go into that. So this idea of the eighth sphere, I think, has a lot to do with our mental development, and I think it has a lot more to do with our kind of clairvoyant spiritual vision than just a physical mass out in space. All right, what else?
Zachary Dixon says, it sounds like the eighth sphere is AI. What do you think?
There's aspects of AI that AI is an harmonic function. And, it's clear, because the idea would be, what is it Steiner's telling us about Ahriman? It is the distribution. It is an entire effort around physical laws without the consideration of anything spiritual. So it loses the spiritual aspect. What they want to do is basically reduce everything down to a granite level. One of the things that Steiner says is that they wanted to turn the Earth into a gigantic deep freeze. There's something that's slow and dense about Ahriman, and that's what he's comfortable in. That's the evolution that he's after. And I think one of the things that Steiner really points out is that, and that really sounds to me like he understands what the future holds. I mean, I almost feel like he's describing the internet at a certain point. And I forgot to read that quote because it is really hard. I'm going to read it actually because I forgot to do this earlier. This is a series of lectures from 1919. Okay, so actually, I'm going to jump ahead here real quick. Well, this is interesting. Where should I pick it up? If these brotherhoods make arrangements for souls to come into the domain of their brotherhood after death, a feat that is quite probably lies within their nefarious power. Okay, these are the brotherhoods that are serving Ahriman. So he's saying when people die and they go into the eighth sphere instead of going the normal track of evolution, he's saying if these brotherhoods make the arrangements for these souls to come into the domain of their brotherhood after death, a feat that is quite probably lies within their nefarious power, then the power of such a brotherhood will thereby be increased immensely. So think of how powerful the way that we've laid this out, these groups are, that each person that they are able to kind of convert into the eighth sphere, speaking again in really mystical terms on this, because that's where he's coming from. So he's saying that one person makes them immensely more powerful, each one. So these materialists are therefore not materialists because they deny the existence of the spirit. They're not that foolish, these materialist initiates, for they know the truth about the spirit very well. So the Ahrimanic groups, that are promoting scientific materialism know very well that there's a large-scale spiritual reality behind this. They do, however, bring it about that souls remain within the material realm after death, so that the brotherhoods are then able to make use of them for their own purposes. In other words, these brotherhoods establish a clientele consisting of the souls of the dead who remain in the earthly realm. The souls of the dead have within them forces that can be directed in many different ways to achieve various effects. By these means, one is able to exert a very special kind of power over those who are not initiated into these things. This is, when I think about artificial intelligence, that is what grabs me, which is that the soul matter part that they'd have to use would be a soul that was under the influence of the eighth sphere. Because if they need not just the physical aspect, if they need a kind of soul aspect in order to achieve AI, to make it real, make it living, that's the kind of track that they can take, which is somebody thinks they're going into their normal evolutionary track after death, and they're going into this thing. Their consciousness is being kind of grabbed. So it's quite fascinating. Okay.
Grandma Timmytoe says, please ask DJ if the moon might be the eighth sphere. Have heard that it is a trap for souls. What does DJ think?
Well, Steiner says the opposite. As a matter of fact, when Sinnott came out, A.P. Sinnott with Esoteric Buddhism, and mentioned this breakthrough thing about the eighth sphere, Steiner said he was under the influence of this group that had placed Blavatsky in occult imprisonment. So, I think it's very important for us to understand that she and that movement were put in this imprisonment for a period of time, so that there's a block of information that's never made a lot of sense in theosophy, and it's where everything's kind of backwards. But no, the moon is deeply connected with the Earth's evolution, and the picture, if you recall, that I showed earlier shows, and very often Steiner will do this, he'll show the eighth sphere interlocking with the Earth. So it's definitely not the moon, because the moon is in the diagram. So, but it is interesting. No, I think if anything, mystically, on a mystical level, I don't think we understand the moon very well.
Plays Live wants to know, is Blavatsky still imprisoned in the eighth sphere?
Fascinating. No, as I understand it, what happened with Blavatsky had a limited point. Some people said it took a decade. Some people said it took 3 years. But Blavatsky according to Steiner, from his own mystical perch and mystical vision, was already working on the side of Theosophy again after she had left. So in the spirit world, she was already working to achieve this reality for Theosophy being, the major movement for humanity. That's a great question, though. I mean, it crossed my mind. Okay.
David Tormina has a couple great questions. DJ, how do you intend to prevent your soul from entering the eighth sphere? And do you think, do you think Keely's research can help humanity transcend the eighth sphere?
Yes, I think anything just like Steiner's work and like Nikola Tesla's work, when we get our hands on these tools, we're much harder to fool, in a sense. Any person can be lulled into the eighth sphere. It doesn't take much. We see it all the time with people getting fascinated, and getting cults are very much like this. They kind of put people in the somnambulous state where they're very suggestible. I think it's very important for us to maintain a kind of centered quality. I talk a lot about things that happen online that I call 2 minutes hate. Well, they'll trot out your favorite political person to hate, and they'll get all huffy and show you that person to hate, and then you hate them. That seems to me a kind of harmonic exchange. And it also seems to me to take you out of your center mentally. So there are so many groups and so many wonderful techniques that we have that are available because of groups like Theosophy and Anthroposophy, but certainly self-remembering, meditation, things along this line that keep you aware of your own mental processes. That's the best way, I would say, to avoid this whole fantasy realm of the eighth sphere, because it's just like what we were talking about with Hollywood or whatever. If they suck you into that illusion, it's different than just I'm watching a movie. But if you, at a certain point, in kind of a virtual reality state, if they sucked you into that, you could find yourself projected into this whole entirely different reality. That's probably the reality that they're moving toward. You get a glimpse of that in Brave New World, which was written in the 30s. So, these people have given us incredible heads up of what's coming. Okay.
I think we need to go back and sort of establish what a mystery school is. Similar Minds is asking, aren't the mystery schools a belief system filling the gap left by religion and maintaining the need for middlemen to provide interpretation? The same old priesthood with, quote, new clothes?
Well, there's nothing wrong with a priesthood if it's dedicated to the right principles and if it serves the people that are there. I don't have any problem with priesthoods. I think what happens is, like any system, it's just like a political system. When it gets to a corruption level, then we're looking at a situation where the information that they possess, they're using as an advantage over their flock. But we see so much of that now. Look at the movements that pop up even around the deep research we've done on like the secret space program and things like that, where you see groups coming up here and there and using it for marketing purposes. Or you see like the CIA coming out and calling for UFO disclosure. I mean, this is the type of things that we see. But in terms of what a mystery school is, it's very simple, really. There were traditions that go all the way back to Egypt and Atlantis, where certain types of information had to be developed. And the best people, basically, the most spiritually evolved people that they had in the groups, would get together and work to open those channels to the higher spiritual realms while in a physical body, go into those states where they could get that information and then disseminate it out to the public. That's a kind of a pure process in its inception. Over time, what happens with mystery schools is there are political considerations, the groups get infiltrated, or they keep the secret so long that they forget what the information is about. So there's a wide range of what secret societies and mystery schools are. And we could not for a second say that they were all good or all bad. But it seems to me there's a key thing when Steiner says it's basically a handful of these 14 individuals who step forward out of this mass and says that we have to release this information to the public back there around 1840. That tells us a lot that it's a system. The mystery schools are a system just like a political system, and things are arrived at by committee and so on. So there's, it's something where you need a lot of people to agree and cooperate along the same line. So, the older mystery schools and some of the ones that have turned, the mystery schools that would not be good for humanity, it's a tricky situation because it's like any group that has power. They don't give it up very easily. But I would say that there's a number of groups who are kind of inspired from a noble perspective that operate in these mystery school circles. And they have a great inheritance that goes all the way back to this antediluvian period.
Denise Evans is asking,
Yes, Denise.
Does DJ think raising our vibrations will keep us from the eighth sphere? Edgar Cayce and Dolores Cannon were on about this.
There's no question about it. And, it's about being in touch with your own spiritual identity, really, is what it comes down to. And understanding that there's a role for you, basically, in developing your spiritual life. I don't think that there's anything, that I've seen in Steiner's work that tells me that he thinks the eighth sphere is inevitable. And it's a warning. It's kind of like, he's gone deep into this process and he's giving us the warning back of this is what is rolling out. Basically, humanity can go in this direction and evolve. And by the way, the evolution that he's talking about, we need our free will in order to achieve that evolution. So we develop that free will on Earth, but the kind of evolution that he's talking about ends in Jupiter, way in the future. That's his mystical vision of this whole thing. But the idea is that and we've seen it happen, when the vibe is lowered, when the conditions in society lower and make the consciousness dull, then these other forces have the ability to harvest them. So there's no question that people like you mentioned, like Edgar Cayce and Dolores Cannon, had a good handle on what that was all about.
Could you address suicide in light of what's happened this week and in esoteric terms?
Well, it's fascinating. I think it's a good opportunity for people to kind of reach out to each other and have conversations with each other and check in with each other whenever things like that happen. In general, when you're talking about suicide on a mystical level, it's a great loss in any sense, human or spiritual, and it's a loss of an opportunity. And what's interesting is, there have been kind of high-flying spiritual discussions that shouldn't a person be able to end their existence if they want to, and and suicide comes under free will and all these things, and we've seen it over and over again. But I guess on the spiritual level, it's understood that since people can be a light to each other, that you're kind of robbing your light from the world. So it's a terrible waste when, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at these people who've achieved all these things in this kind of modern lifestyle, and but we can see that aspects of their life become very empty. That's the thing that we need to talk about, which is, why would somebody fill up their lives with so many empty things, and that is definitely a materialist versus a spiritualist reality conversation to be had.
I think there's also a big focus on happiness. There's all these books on how to be happy.
Yeah.
And as if happiness is the point of being alive, when it seems to be something else entirely. Really the point is about fulfillment and service. And if you make that your goal instead of happiness, which is fleeting, you can have a much richer life and less frustrating in a way.
Oh, isn't that interesting? I remember very well the Cayce groups called Search for God. And what they would do, the first rule that they would teach people were not like, achieve third eye vision. The first rule was cooperation. That's always interesting to me. The second rule is that it was about attunement and service, right? So when you get into different types of movements that deal with spiritual realities, there's a great emphasis on attunement. You have to do this in order to have the right connection and, connect to your higher self and all the rest of it. But in the Casey work, the service part is crucial. You can't get the attunement going right unless you do the service with it. So it's attunement and service. You always have to keep that in mind. Those two work very, very well together.
Hugh Hoyland asks, any ideas on the origin of our Ahriman? Is he a higher being who fell, a lower being that rose, etc.?
Well, I can tell you this, and it's deep in the Steiner work, which is that, he's very associated with the early origins of humanity, like when we were first in development, which is why he has such a role with us. And he's also deeply connected to Earth evolution. So one of the things that Steiner says about him is there's no getting around him. And this kind of intense technology push that is happening as a result of the Ahrimanic influences hitting. What we need to do basically is apprehend out of the machine our own self-mastery. And I think that's something crucial when we're talking about Ahriman. It's not about becoming a Luddite and avoiding the incredible advances that we're going to move into, and I'm sure they're going to go even further. But it is about confronting them spiritually and facing that battle on. For example, people demanding ethics in cloning. This is absolutely a crucial Ahrimanic battleground. There's no doubt about it. The idea that Ahriman is preparing for his own incarnation now, physical, according to Steiner, I think is quite fascinating. And I made a note the last time I mentioned this, which I think is episode 10, that there's something that is called D-Wave, which Alana Freeland was nice enough to explain to me, and we're going to have her come back on the show. I see your free TV out there. I want to say hello. You do great work, and thank you. I definitely would love to talk to you anytime. One of the things that I see about all this is that, in looking out at this period of time that we're in, is that, Steiner really had a handle on what was going to happen, basically. And so that Ahriman and the idea of preparing him for an incarnation, I think, is quite interesting, because they have this D-Wave chip that Alana Freeland explained to me has to be kept at temperatures so cold that it is space cold. So it has to be kept at this incredibly low temperature in order to function. And I kept thinking to myself, when Steiner talks about an actual incarnation of this sort of technological being, we all think, well, he's going to incarnate as a human being and be this kind of leader antichrist. But the idea of him as a gigantic AI struck me. And, things like D-Wave and CERN have that Ahrimanic. It's almost like when they talk about them, I'm getting a real Steiner buzz in my ear. Okay, what else you got?
David Donaway, does the War of the Mystery Schools reflect on J.P. Farrell's sense of the cosmic war, or is it a newer conflict with different entities and agendas?
Well, that's very interesting. What was the first part of that?
Does the War of the Mystery Schools?
The Mystery Schools recount the war that took place that Farrell is talking about in terms of his Cosmic War series. So what they would do is they would hold the information and the records around that. But I don't think that, there's an echo back there, just like there's an echo of the incredible blast from Atlantis, right? We have that. It's kind of a memory, and it comes up in stories over and over again. If you think about like even Noah's Ark and these flood stories. But this idea of a civilization that rises and blows itself up or destroys itself, is destroyed in an inundation, whatever it happens to be, that is one of those kind of fundamental understandings deep in our consciousness. And I always like to think of this too, which is that people in these esoteric circles talk about how humanity's actions influence things like sunspots or influence things like tornadoes and terrible weather. How does that come to happen? It's an interesting thing to consider the types of powers and abilities that we have. This is why I want to reorient people around thinking about the UFO file also, because there is a group out there which is like the aliens will come in and save us. It's not about that. If anything, if there are off-world groups, then, and I'm sure that there are, they're peers. And you wouldn't pray to, a peer. You might get advice from them, but you wouldn't pray to them. So that's a very interesting thing around it. I think if we can get a lot of superstition away from the UFO file idea if we understand them a little bit differently also.
David also asks, which agencies and organizations and movements express this spiritual battle today?
Oh, well, as we've recounted in this series, certainly theosophy was at the heart of so many political movements over the past 100 years. If you want to look for them right now, we've got this tremendous link with Trump's uncle to Tesla, and there's a reason for that. Because if you go deeper into John Trump, you find that he's deeply associated with Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush, anyone who studies the subject will know that Vannevar Bush, if you go even an inch deep, is in charge of the UFO file. So the Clintons and their big push around the whole letting out this Tom DeLonge thing and all that, and the CIA groups promoting that, you can bet that when they talk about the left, and I don't mean this politically, but when they're speaking about it in mystical terms, this brotherhood of the left, and what they're up to, the kind of aggressive tactics that they took against Blavatsky and people like that, those are the people who would try to control the way that we see things like off-world civilizations. So yes, we definitely see in the political situation, always the mystery schools are working through political actors. It's inevitable. Wow, fantastic. These are great questions. I'm really blown away. I want to invite everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter that keeps us in touch, basically. And this is going to be so important as we do these shows. We're into part 13 here, but the show, the actual episodes now, the way we have them laid out, will go to part 20 for the second part of the series. We have 7 more episodes in this series, and that's a lot of information for us to get out. And God knows when you wake up in that YouTube channel, you never know. Have they moved to silence it? Are they off Twitter or whatever it happens to be? So keep us in touch with each other. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, but also get behind the site too. Take on a deeper, sign up for the subscription. Basically, it's $4 a month. It keeps us in touch with each other. And it supports the show and gets things rolling. I always like to include here, by the way, that the sites that I support and that I think that everyone should get behind, along with darkjournalist.com, like Solari.com, and we have a fantastic episode coming up with Catherine Austin Fitz, who just got back from Australia. Joseph Farrell at Giza Death Star, and Alexandra Bruce at Forbidden Knowledge TV. I mean, these people are doing incredible work, and it's great for us to get behind them. We've seen what other groups have to offer and the conferences and all this kind of nonsense that's out there, and we have really good people in these alternative media circles that don't play into that whole scene. They play into giving you the real information and the good stuff that we need in order to get a real picture of what's happening. That's the transparency that we've been talking about in this show. So support the shows that you think deserve it, and definitely get on board, become a member of darkjournalist.com. And that's really something where you can take a direct role in helping us to get these truths out. And make sure you're on there for the newsletter. Okay, you're up, Olivia.
David Tormina has a great question. DJ, can we put a psychic prison around Ahriman?
Well, you've got the right idea, right? Turn the 8th sphere around on him. Ahriman is like an evolutionary force. It's a gigantic thing that, we can't just take a shot at it and make it go away. It's a force, and it's a force that lives in humanity as well as developing a realm around it. It has a relationship with humanity. So the best way to discourage Ahriman's progress is by not falling for the kind of technological version of the Superman world, and by not falling for this limited idea of our, evolution being scientific materialism, we've seen that really doesn't go anywhere. And so the idea, when they try to remove the spiritual idea and they're telling you, hey, you're getting free, you don't have to like worship at church anymore, you're set. The whole point would be, if you were liberated from a religious organization, it was because you arrived at your own spiritual foundation and you didn't need them, as such, in order to practice your own spiritual life. So I would say the best way to shoot down the Ahrimanic forces is by being more in touch with your own spiritual side. And really seeing a lot of the propaganda that comes out of the scientific wing saying that, we've got you covered, we're really in charge. And, that whole kind of push that they have going on is really to drain you of any responsibility and power over your own spiritual identification. Okay.
Initiate Seeker, DJ, what is the difference between Steiner's Ahriman entities and Gnostic Archon entities?
He is, in fact, an Archon. And you have the other levels that he describes, like the Asuras, another one. And we can find those in Hindu mythology. But it is this force that's been represented. Remember, Ahriman comes from the Persian mythology. This is something that those deep initiates have understood for a long time. The Rakshasas, that is a whole realm. I printed out something about them. I guess I didn't use it, but those are all Ahrimanic forces. So this idea of Ahriman as an Archon, he is sort of like at the head of he's the head host of all of this fleet of Archons. And their version of reality is control. This is an interesting thing. If we get beyond, the actual thinking of just people that we're in competition with or people who would misuse power, the force on a spiritual, mystical level, looking at Ahriman, the idea is that they want to control humanity. And so we have ideas about evil. We have ideas about ethical balance and all the rest of it. But I think we need something even deeper, which is we need understanding of what it is that we're tangoing with. Okay.
Marsha Zell, does the eighth sphere of Sufism connect with this? Believe it was called the imaginal. And Carrie Flynn says, and what about Gurdjieff? Did he not identify imagination with a kind of escapist tendency of mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the Gurdjieff movement is kind of the correction to theosophy. So you come out of theosophy and all these people start going into their imagination about, I'm communicating with a master or whatever it is. And without doing the work in order to be able to do that. Of course, it takes a long time. So that they were on this kind of head trip about it. And I think the Gurdjieff Fourth Way movement is like a correction to it. It says, what the best thing that you can do for your spiritual life is clean the kitchen. I mean, the emphasis around de-emphasizing your ego structure and like doing physical work, and that you need to work in order to stay awake because humankind is asleep, and that people under these evolutionary laws, the way they're set up, are acting mechanically, and they're becoming more and more mechanical with industry. And, they're talking 1920s. So not even really the full deal yet. So I would say that the Gurdjieff movement has a lot to offer, and it's deep. It's a branch of those mystery schools that came out. He definitely had association with those schools. I don't think anyone who's been near the Gurdjieff work and the Enneagram and the Fourth Way teaching would could possibly doubt it. But it's interesting. They had to leave certain things out. That would, it's a method, just like they leave reincarnation out. So you just focus on this one. And that's something that they did back in the 3rd century with Christianity. They said we have to get that reincarnation out of there because, they need to respect us now. And it's interesting because they cut off a whole range of understanding there. And one of the things that Steiner said modern theosophy was responsible for, and it was an absolute obligation if they were going to come out and say these things, was to present people with a real picture of that aspect of their lives. I mean, it's interesting if you take on reincarnation from the point of view that it's real, and if you believe in it, then can you imagine the not having the information, not realizing that? It's an incredible disadvantage. So I think there is a great awakening that's taken place there on that. But yeah, wow, the movements you mentioned are just fascinating. Okay, you're up.
Giovanni Delgado, is the deep state hiding aspects of the afterlife from us?
Yes, absolutely. And they study that on a very deep level. The CIA has such incredible programs around remote viewing. They've tried to remote view what happens in those terms. What we know about with them, remember, those are programs that we know about. But they've always been very interested in that because they want anything that is an advantage. And what's interesting to me about all that is that the kind of direction that groups that have that kind of power could be getting from a very shadowy astral sources. I mean, it kind of boggles the mind. All right, we'll take a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, so how does the CC Jarvis asks, the eighth sphere, also known as purgatory?
No, I would say that purgatory relates more to personal choice. Now, I think you could make a case for it, but it seems to me that the eighth sphere is more about being in a condition. The Matrix kind of captures this a little bit. The reality was physically they were plugged in with all this kind of fluid and stimulation stuff, and they were living out this simulation in their mind. That seems to me to get very close to the concept of the eighth sphere. I think purgatory is more of a concept that would lend itself to someone's own choices, and it comes about more through personal, individual action. I think that the eighth sphere is more of falling into, kind of sucking into a vortex of thought. Virtual reality for me feels like you go into virtual reality. If you didn't come out, you're in the eighth sphere.
Okay, Thomas Tyson, why is Ahriman
Great question, by the way.
merely a force and not also a self-aware identity, a being?
Well, we have to be careful about generalizing things into human conceptions. So anthropomorphizing them, right? This is a force. It has an identity, for sure, and we have to refer to it as, he or it. But no, there's no question that if it's a force that can move through the entirety of humanity, if it can develop planetary spheres, it's not something that we could turn to and say, like, in a personal way, like the CEO of a corporation or something. I mean, it's not an individual personal being. It's a force that would move beings. So, I think you want to think of it more of like when you're talking about individuals versus a nation state, it's a collection with an identity and a force. And so it has that ability, I would say, to act in a very, in a non-personal fashion. It's really not a personal devil. It's more of a something that is embedded in evolution. So it's something that we need to be aware of and to overcome, as opposed to just denying that it exists. Yeah, it is a great question, though. God, the questions are terrific tonight. You guys are on fire. That's the way I look at it.
Peter Bayonne, what is the manifestation of the opposing force of Ahriman?
Well, there's no doubt that it is the Christian tradition, the mystery of Golgotha, right? It is the overcoming the Ahrimanic forces in the underworld that took place during Christ's resurrection. That's the opposite event. It's, in anthroposophical terms, they call it the mystery of Golgotha, but this was set up for a long time because the groups, the Essenes and the different groups that prepared because you have to remember the understanding of Jesus that we get through so many the basic doctrine. I mean, there's so many important things there, but they miss the entire esoteric level because, of course, when you get into the esoteric tradition, Jesus had all these other lifetimes, and his first incarnation was Adam. So you understand his totality much better when we look at it from an esoteric point of view. So, I think it's important when we go back to that period and we see the incredible change in the evolutionary path away from Ahriman and towards our natural development came about as from the mystery of Golgotha, that entire event, that's where the whole esoteric Christianity comes from. That's the foundation of the Western initiation traditions. So yeah, that would be the opposite force from Ahriman.
Kathy Carr 207, does DJ believe that transhumanism and the chemicals in chemtrails are connected? And Mike Jones says, combination of fluoride in the water, GMO food, and aerosolized aluminum in the chemtrails work synergistically to keep us docile, calcifying the pineal gland. Pineal equals consciousness.
Well, I think you've hit on something there because I'm going to go back to that picture. There's something about this shot of this card where the sun is carrying this head, but the person has been dispatched. There's something key, I think, in this image that relates directly to what you said about the calcification of the pineal gland. Now, we know that if you study the esoteric tradition, the pineal gland was an actual eye at a certain point, and that it retreated eventually because of the density of mankind's activities, so that we lost that third eye vision. And now when you run across people who have it, it's such a great, wild thing to see when this person has some piece of that left over, like great telepathy, or they can predict events or whatever it happens to be, which is why people like Edgar Cayce stand out so much for us. But I do think it's fascinating because the thing that Steiner's trying to point out over and over again is it's all about the head. So the mind, the ability to enter into clairvoyant vision, comes about through the use of that pineal center that you're talking about. That's the true third eye. So that seems to me what they're targeting, because of course our ability to project, our ability to, the great imagination that we have, all comes from that end of things. And if I could make this a very non-mystical explanation about everything that Steiner has said, and I think that he's really given us an incredible picture. But if I were to break it down, in everyday life in the 21st century, if I can get your brain locked into a device that tells your brain synapses how to function, and if I can feed you messages through that, visual messages, and manipulate your emotions and all the rest of it, then we're deep into an harmonic situation, and we need a solution. Basically, we need a new way to interact with these things with the knowledge that they have that ability to kind of convert our thinking process into this harmonic process. Okay, 2 more questions.
Titan-blooded, are virtual reality and video games tools to lead us into the 8th sphere?
Well, they are. They don't have to be. This is the interesting thing. I think this is interesting. A number of these things are tools, so there's no question about it. But if I can mechanically induce you to go into a clairvoyant state, that's not the same thing as being in a clairvoyant state out of the fact that you have learned the method for communicating with your deeper unconscious. So they're 2 very different processes. And for me, when I look at video games, what I see is that they're training your unconscious to be a certain way. I mean, they're doing other things too. We found out, we did all this research on Candy Crush, which was incredibly addictive for so many people that we knew. And, this was the nature of the thing. The entire society is built up around it. Now, I think that we can take a certain amount of entrainment, a certain amount of hypno-programming. It's in there in society. But I think at this level, at this point, we're so deep into it that we're getting flooded with it. And, it's on your phones, it's on your computers, it's on your TV. So you're surrounded by it. And basically, we've seen people do the most idiotic things. Olivia and I watched people walking in the street during the whole Pokemon craze, and it was like watching complete like possession. They needed an exorcism from Pokemon. I mean, this was the nature of the situation. And I'll tell you, we're laughing now, but it
was scary.
It was definitely scary. And can you imagine being even a little bit awake and everyone out here has seen it. How did you think about it? I mean, it was that's very Ahrimanic stuff because it takes you right out of the present moment. And it doesn't lead you to glory or anything. You're just chasing around a video game.
Okay. Your favorite, Bend Over.
Bend Over.
Why Hollywood and music industry puts out obvious symbolism in modern culture?
Well, Ben, I would say that there's no question that an agenda gets worked. See, there are deep, deep groups in charge of these things, and a lot of the secret societies that we've touched on tonight control so many of the centers because so much of what they do is about propaganda. So if they want you to be in a certain state of mind about something, like gender neutrality, like removing his and her, and getting you into this mindset about that, which is a totally different thing from saying you're open-minded about having transgender be a part of the culture. That's a totally separate issue. But when they remove the naming, this is an occult process, you see, because names are always deep on the esoteric side, what you name something, what you refer to something as. Just like when they started calling America the homeland instead of the United States. See, the homeland doesn't have a constitution. The United States has a constitution. There's a big difference. So yeah, I'd say we're pretty deep into it now. Okay, we'll take one more question.
A cult fan. Can Daniel recommend a good method to tell good spirits from bad?
Well, it's trial and error, isn't it? But certainly there's techniques that when you enter into any kind of meditative state or a state where you would be consciously contacting something, or seeking that kind of contact, where you surround yourself literally with only the ability for something good to come through. You have that ability. This is the interesting thing too. When I talk about the UFO file, what I get concerned about is people get very worked up over this idea of the ET communication thing being spiritual in nature. And, the truth is that as great as and as fantastic as off-world civilizations could be, we really have that ability within us to go to the highest spiritual place, which is where they would need to go to get whatever information they needed to go also. So I think it's very important, and I want to go back to this for a second, because these types of things, the kind of legacy from the mystery school tells us how important the things that we can do are. So that's something very different than saying that, there's some off-world group that will save humanity or something. I think we want to think of those groups as peers and not in the kind of like Greer, the Greer type way of some alien saviors or something. And with that, what a fantastic...
One important final question.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so I want to leave on Julie Smith. How many people with consciousness would it take to awaken those who are asleep?
Well, it's the biblical story, right? It's if you can find 10 good men in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. No, it's a very small number. There's an interesting Casey reading, which takes place just before Pearl Harbor, where people are really concerned that America's going to get hit from the Nazis or the Japanese. And he said that if the people in this room basically were keeping themselves attuned spiritually to that not happening, it wouldn't happen. And I think the people in that room, it was some kind of a ARE Congress, and maybe they had 40 people in the room. So it's a small number. It's a small number. Always. Wow, what a fantastic group. And we have great people out there. It's good to see. I know that we have, I thought, yes, It's amazing, right? Ice Angel is out there. Fantastic. It's great to see you. And Rika, the hopeful voluntarist. It's always great to see you. Erica McLaughlin. Yeah, and a lot of new names too. Fantastic. Great to see everyone. Great questions tonight. And that's part 13 of our X series. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to come back. Next Friday, we have a very important, exciting interview that I'm going to put out. It's a recorded interview that we're going to record on Thursday. And I'm not going to tell you who it is, but then we're coming back on Saturday live, a little bit different. But we're going to come back Saturday at 6 p.m. All the details will be in the newsletter or on our Facebook page. Thank you so much for being with us. No Name, I see you out there. It's great to have you. And just terrific questions. I appreciate it. And we will we'll have you all back next week. And again, watch for that special interview Friday that will be recorded. And then we'll be back with you with X Series Part 14 next Saturday night at 6. So, Najat, it's great to see you out there. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you on Saturday.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
And that's next Saturday, not tomorrow. Olivia, what can I say? Outstanding.
Oh,
Unbelievable.
they put me through my paces.
You can take a deep breath now
I know.
and think about what you want to have for dinner.
Tacos and fish food.
Oh. That sounds pretty addictive.
But no tequila.
No tequila.
No tequila tonight.
No tequila tonight. Yes, you're too conscious.
Yes.
I guess we're going to be super conscious tonight. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.